It's Friday Eve, 3B, and it's time for tonight's story. We are on chapter 15. In last night's story, Natalie had just come up with a plan that she thought was going to work for both Lars and Banger and herself, and now she is getting ready to tell them. That night was even warmer than last night. 24 hours ago, that would have terrified Natalie, serving as a reminder of the sad secret her mother had told her. But after she'd had time to come to terms with it, she saw it another way. A warm, beautiful night like tonight was the perfect opportunity to go down to the beach and spend one last playtime with her favorite porpoise. She'd put on her best swimsuit. She'd found the frisbee that had been tucked away in the Prater's shed since last November and threw it for Lars a few times in case he wasn't familiar with the concept. If he wasn't, he caught on quick. And then she'd put it in a beach bag with some other items and walked with Lars and her father down to Perkins Cove. Since their big blow-up Friday night, Natalie's father had been doing everything he could to make it up to his daughter. He'd been the first to encourage her crazy plan, and he'd been the one to reach out to Diver, to Bob, and Natalie's mother, and bring them all together to hammer out the details. But truth be told, Natalie had been ready to forgive him before she'd even made it back from the beach. She'd spent a lot of time angry at her parents this year. Too much time. Right now, she had bigger things to worry about. When they got back to the beach, Banger was just swimming back in from another one of his food runs out in the Gulf. The setting sun threw its rays across the waves like rose-colored oil sliding over the water. It looked like a scene from one of Nancy Jane's paintings. Actually, it looked like the paint itself. Thinking of Nancy Jane made Natalie smile, just as much as Lars running to greet Banger with all his characteristic enthusiasm made her smile. "You found your good thing," Nancy Jane had said. "Jump in." She turned to her father as she pulled the frisbee from her bag. "Want to come in with me?" "Oh, I don't know," he said, but his eyes were already out on the water, where Banger had just done a barrel roll. "I'm wearing my work shorts and—" "I'll race you," Natalie said, and she was off. And behind her she heard the sound of her father's wallet, cell phone, and keys hitting the sand as he emptied his pockets and ran after her. That evening was the best good thing she'd ever had. The frisbee turned out to be a hit with dog and porpoise alike, and after some convincing that large humans could be just as okay to play with as small humans, Banger and Prater managed to unite for a quality splash contest. Natalie knew she might never get the chance to do something like this again, and rather than let it make her sad, she used it to make every second count, wringing as much fun out of the moment as possible. Well, maybe it still made her a little sad, but maybe that was okay. Maybe that was life. Soon the sun had set completely, and the stars began to emerge over the Atlantic Ocean. "Okay," Mr. Prater said, attempting to rub some of the salt water out of his eyes with his equally water-covered knuckles. "We should get home soon." Natalie nodded. The plan was to begin early the next morning, and they'd need all the rest they could get beforehand. "Do you want to say goodbye to Banger?" Mr. Prater asked. At the sound of his name, Banger, ever the attention hog, released a hopeful puff. Natalie considered the porpoise warmly and then shook her head. "No," she said, "I'll do it tomorrow." Or never, she thought. The truth was, she didn't know if she'd have the guts to say goodbye. Her father shrugged. "Suit yourself," he said. "Come on, Lars, let's go home." The three of them turned to make their way out of the water and froze. Someone was standing on the beach by all of their belongings, watching so quietly in the darkness that Natalie hadn't even seen they were there. It was Natalie's mother. "Hello, Jim," she said as her ex-husband and daughter approached her. "Hello, Natalie." "And hello, Lars." She crouched down and opened her arms for a hug at a dog height, and after a moment's consideration, Lars seemed to decide this was acceptable and trotted happily into the hug. As Maria Prater scratched Lars's back, she looked up at Mr. Prater and Natalie. I realized I'd never actually seen it, she said. The two of them, or the three of you, or, I guess, the four of you, all playing together. She gave Lars one last pat and stood up. It was wonderful, she said. I'm glad I got to see it. Natalie's father seemed unsure of what to say, but Natalie was getting better at this, and she stepped in for him. I'm glad you got to see it too, Natalie said, and the best part was she meant it. Even in the darkness, Natalie's mother's smile was radiant. Thank you, she said. Then she put her hands on her hips and bit her bottom lip. There's something else I came to tell you, though, she said. Bob received word from the people at Bangor Sea Lab. They got in touch with some of their colleagues at a different lab in Belfast who have also been tracking a member of the pod. They confirmed the pod's location. They're a little bit farther south than normal, but they're all together and all in about the area we'd anticipated. That's fantastic, Mr. Prater said. Then we can lead Bangor right back to his family. Isn't that great, Natalie? Natalie wasn't sure what to say. It was all becoming real now. In less than 12 hours, this whole adventure would hopefully be coming to a happy ending. But the only way for her to reach that happy ending was to get through the sad ending. Below her, Lars, clearly deciding he wasn't getting any more pats from Natalie's mother, wandered back to Natalie and laid his head down on her feet. His whiskers tickled at her sandy ankles. Where once his fur had been wiry and scraggly, Lars' coat was now shinier and healthier, even after just a couple of weeks with the Praters. Nothing had been better for him than being with a family that loved him, in an environment where he could be safe. It's not giving up, Natalie thought. It's helping. Great, she said. That's great news. She leaned down, picked up her beach bag, and hoisted it over her shoulder. Now, let's go get some sleep. Because tomorrow morning, she thought, we save a porpoise. Chapter 16, Bangor. Because Bangor never really slept, Bangor never really woke up, at least in the traditional sense, and because of that, Bangor had never really experienced a rude awakening. But Sunday morning, floating in the middle of Perkins Cove, he just about got one. The morning started like any other since Bangor had come to Ogunquit. As he bobbed up and down in the gentle waves of dawn, Bangor faced the shore, resting the left side of his brain and using his right side to enjoy the feeling of the sun sliding slowly across his back. He'd been noticing it more and more recently. When the sun shone down here in the south, it really shone. They had sunshine where he was from in the north, of course, but it never seemed to work quite as hard or make things quite as warm as the sun that fell on Ogunquit. Every morning the water around Bangor got just a little bit warmer, just a little bit faster. He'd never felt anything like it. I'm not sure you're supposed to feel anything like it, said a voice in the back of Bangor's head. Bangor tried to push the thought away, but there was something about the tone of concern that reminded Bangor of someone. He realized it reminded him of Kittery, of his mother. Now there was a thought Bangor really didn't want to deal with this early in the morning. I'll worry about my pie later, he thought. Right now, I need to get some rest. But the side of him that was awake registered a new noise, one that started soft and then gradually got louder. It was a drawbridge, slowly creaking into its open position. The bridge, with its chorus of squeaks and groans, signaled the start of the workday in Ogunquit. Bangor was used to this by now, and he was also used to what came next, the thrum of boat engines starting up as a handful of fishermen began their daily trip out of the harbor. But this morning it quickly became clear that something unusual was happening. Rather than stopping at 3 or 4 engines, the boats kept roaring to life, one after the other, and then another, and another, and another. until it was impossible for Banger to even halfway sleep through the din. His left eye snapped open in irritation, and he turned toward the open drawbridge to squeak his disapproval at the boats that slipped one by one out of the harbor. It was no use, of course. There was no way the humans would hear him over their noisy vessels, which were only getting noisier still as more and more of them started up their engines. And yet, for a brief moment, Banger thought that he might have heard someone call back over the engines. The unexpected noise came from far across the water, where the first of the boats was just now clearing the edge of Perkins Cove. The noise sounded like barking. Instinctively, Banger lurched through the water toward the mystery sound, which so resembled the voice of his good friend Lars. But if it actually was Lars, Banger was unable to tell for sure, because within seconds even more engines had turned on in the harbor, and it soon became impossible to hear anything else. Banger came to a halt, confused to the point of being unable to move. In all of this time here, he'd never known the fishermen to do anything remotely like this. It felt like every water molecule in the cove was vibrating with the sound of the whole fishing fleet come to life. It made echolocation impossible. It hurt Banger's head, and it caused his initial irritation to quickly give way to panic. Clearly, it was time to get out of the harbor, but where could he go? By now, there were half a dozen boats already out on the open water, and rather than dispersing, they'd all perched just past the edge of Perkins Cove, as if idling in wait just for Banger. Maybe they were waiting for him. Maybe that was what the barking had been. A signal from Lars to come find him, to follow the boats out into the Atlantic. But why? Well, Banger wouldn't find out by sitting around here. With one last irritated chirp, "Fine, I'm coming," he took off through the water, toward the open water, and away from the wall of sand blasting behind him. But the moment he started to move, the wall of sand began to follow him, and fast. Banger couldn't be sure of how many boats were peeling out of the harbor and into the wider waters of Perkins Cove. In that moment, he couldn't be sure of anything. The boats, already so terribly noisy when they were just idling in the harbor, became even worse when they were racing toward him, bombarding Banger with an overwhelming racket. Within seconds, all of the poor porpoise's remaining senses were obliterated. It was awful. Waves of sand and waves of water crashed and combined and broke apart around him. Any clicks he sent out in front of him seemed to come back from beside and behind him. Banger darted this way and that, trying to find a direction that would take him out of the cove and away from the chaos. But the world had become directionless. Up was down, down was up. From somewhere in the back of Banger's brain, pushing its way through the pandemonium, came a thought that made him feel, somehow, even worse. This was what Uncle York must have experienced when that first fleet had fallen upon them. At the time, Uncle York had suddenly become unable to swim straight to save his life. And now, as Banger ducked and rolled through the thrashing water, he felt the same way. It was just as terrible to go through as it had been to witness. And it was even worse for Banger, knowing that he had abandoned his uncle and possibly the rest of his pod, to suffer this terrifying feeling alone. What if Banger never made it out of here, and the last time his family saw him was while they swam through something like this? Banger couldn't stand that thought. He had to make his escape, and he had to do it soon. But as the boats bore down on top of him, Banger didn't know if he would ever get the chance. Chapter 17. Natalie. For Natalie, the morning started with a parade. Or it almost did. Technically, the morning started with Lars leaping onto Natalie's bed and taking one big lick from the bottom of her chin to the inside of her nose. His methods were sloppy, but his timing couldn't have been better. It was 5:15 in the morning. 5 minutes before Natalie's alarm was set to go off, and 20 minutes before the sun was supposed to rise, at least according to the fisherman's almanac that Natalie had pored over in the Prater's kitchen the night before. And if they'd done as she asked, soon every fisherman and lobsterman in Ogunquit would be waking up as well, rolling out of bed for the big day. As Natalie went to the bathroom to wash the dog slobber off her face, she hoped desperately that those alarms actually were going off across town. She figured she had only one chance to pull this plan off, and she didn't want to think about what might happen if today didn't go right. By the time she was dressed and at the kitchen table, she was too nervous to speak. And together with her father, who never spoke much in the early mornings anyway, she wolfed down a quiet and quick breakfast while Lars, not so quietly, wolfed down a bowl of fish. Then they looked at each other, nodded, gathered up their stuff, and made their way to the front door and out into the dawn. "Do you think anyone's actually going to come and help?" Natalie asked, bending down to fasten the leash around Lars's neck. "I mean, at least a few people will, right?" Her father, who had just finished locking the door to the shack, turned to face the street. "I think we'll be fine," he said with a smile, pointing out toward the street. Natalie stood back up and followed his gaze and gasped, because that's when she saw the parade. To be fair, it wasn't totally unusual for the boat owners of Ogunquit to get up before sunrise, especially the ones who had to work. But for every single one of them to head for the cove at the same time, and on a Sunday no less, was an extraordinary thing to think about, and it turned out even more extraordinary to behold. Now, in the early, almost late tramping down a road that was normally just stirring to life at this moment of the morning, was an ever-growing stream of seafaring townspeople, pouring forth from their porches and garage doors, all of them headed in the same direction, toward the sea. And they weren't the only ones. As an awestruck Natalie led Lars and her father down the driveway to take their places in the procession, she saw still more people she recognized from around town. The spouses of the fishermen had come along to see what all the fuss was about, and that meant their children had come too, running between the legs of the adults or bouncing up and down in their parents' arms, if they hadn't quite woken up yet. As the sun broke over Ogunquit, Natalie's heart filled with joy and gratitude. "I don't believe it," she breathed. "I do," her father smiled. "You're always going out of your way to help others. Now we all get to help you." Hearing it put like that almost made Natalie tear up, but it reminded her of something else. She had work to do, and she wasn't going to get a better chance than now to do it. As more and more people joined the parade, Natalie and Lars ran back and forth from fisherman to fisherman, reminding everyone exactly what they had to do. Who would be on the first wave of boats out of the harbor? Who would hang back and bring up the rear? What channel to set their radios to? What signal to listen for? And most importantly, how crucial it was that they not do anything at all until they got that signal. In short, Natalie did everything in her power to make sure that absolutely everything went according to plan. Just half an hour later, everyone was right where they were supposed to be. The boats now surrounded Bangor and the harbor, but things were not going according to plan. "What's taking him so long?" Mr. Prater asked. "I don't know. He seemed to be getting it a few minutes ago," Natalie said as she leaned over the gunwale and peered through a pair of binoculars. The starting of the engine seemed to have stirred Bangor awake, just as Natalie had hoped. She'd seen his fin turn this way and that, as if trying to locate the source of the sound, and it was possible, she'd imagined, but she could have sworn that he'd turned to face the Maria P. at one point. The point when Lars, overcame with excitement, planted his two front paws on the gunwale and began barking at the top of his lungs. But the farther out they got, the less Bangor seemed able to keep his bearings focused on the Maria P. None of this kept Lars from barking like his life depended on it. Just a few weeks ago, Natalie reflected, this would have felt like getting everything she wanted. Lars riding with them in the boat with her father's blessing. But life was more complicated now, and Natalie had a problem to solve before she could truly enjoy anything. We can't just wait around forever. That was Mr. Grundy's voice. Nobody does anything until you hear the word go, Mr. Prater said. Be patient with the porpoise, said Diver Bob. All this commotion is probably confusing for him. Even though he wasn't technically a fisherman, Diver Bob still had a boat and still volunteered to help out. That was another thing that was probably pretty nice, but Natalie didn't have time to focus on that right now. Come on, Banger, Natalie muttered under her breath, and even though she knew it couldn't possibly make a difference, she let out a long, slow, hopeful whistle like the kind she'd heard Banger make so many times before. At that moment, Banger finally turned back toward the open water and began to swim straight for the Prater's boat. Yes, Natalie exclaimed. There we go, Diver Bob whooped. Did he say go? Asked someone over Mr. Prater's radio. Wait, cried the Praters, but it was too late. One of the boats in the harbor roared to life, and a split second later, the rest of them followed suit. Even from all the way out at the edge of the cove, the sound was tremendous. It's too soon, Natalie cried. And indeed, as she watched in dismay, the gray streak under the water that was Banger suddenly took a hard left from his original path, and then a right, and then a dozen crazy dives in no clear direction. The sound of the fleet seemed to have disoriented him, and it looked like he was in a state of complete confusion, or possibly even panic. Stop, Natalie cried. Dad, tell him to stop. And that's where we're going to stop today. It was great to see everybody today. I got to see all of you, or just about all of you, if not your parents, and we hopefully will be able to finish up A Dog's Porpoise tomorrow night. So have a great night, and you will hear from me again tomorrow. Good night.